All right, all right. What's going on, YouTube? So, I want to touch on a few things here. As you can see from the title of the video, this is going to be about the A sides in boxing, the Bud Crawford versus Spence situation, and why I'm beginning to lose patience here. And we're going to really break this down. Okay. So, with this being said, I'm just going to let it be known. Yeah, I am a Bud fan. I'm also a fan of Spence as a fighter, but I'm more of a fan of Bud, mainly because I've been a fan of Bud's longer. So, he's been on the pro circuit for a considerable amount of time in comparison to Spence. So, let's get started on this. All right, and this video is stemming from a debate that I got into on Fanon's channel, I believe it was, where someone had told me essentially that Bud Crawford needs to do the legwork here regarding the Errol Spence Jr. fight. Now, let me go on record and say this because I keep it real. Initially, I was one of the Bud fans that kind of thought the same thing and said, well, he could accept the 60-40 offer, and maybe Bud does need to go see Al Heyman and make the fight happen. This was actually a point that was made by Black Fight Fan TV when he used Canelo Alvarez as an example, being that Caleb Plant is actually with the PBC and Canelo was not, and he wanted the fight. So he was able to go sit down with Al Heyman and co. and make the fight happen. But there's some things we got to consider here that are important that I think get often overlooked. The first thing is this. While Canelo did indeed go and sit down with the PBC, we have to keep in mind that Canelo had the utmost leverage in that situation because he's a multi-division world champion. He's, a $350 million net worth fighter, essentially, and he is the A side for the entire sport of boxing. He is essentially what Floyd Mayweather was before he left the sport on a slightly smaller scale. So it is very easy for someone with that type of leverage to go over to a promotional entity and say, hey, this is what I want, give it to me. But there's a flip side to this, right? Because if he was able to go over there and say, this is what I want, give it to me because he's the A side, this goes back to one of the original points that I always make. In boxing, per tradition and per the culture, the A side is usually the one who has all the leverage that can actually dictate the terms. Now, we've heard this narrative from several diehard Errol Spence Jr. fans that Earl is essentially the A side here, right? This means Earl holds all the cards along with the PBC and all the leverage. You understand what I'm saying here? This means essentially, regardless of Crawford's legal team and management and who he has behind him, he does not have enough leverage to go to the table and make demands of Al Heyman or Errol Spence Jr. or anyone on his team or promotional entity. Do you guys understand this? Okay, this is not rocket science here, all right? And part of the reason why Crawford doesn't have the type of leverage he needs to go to Al Heyman and dictate and say, this is what I want, this is what I'm laying out on the table, is because of you diehard Spence fans. Not all of you, but some of you who are, what I should say is not even diehard Spence fans. What I should say are Spence fans who don't like Bud Crawford, or Spence fans who are blind Spence fans, right? Your fan base, not the entire fan base, but that sector of your fan base has been extremely toxic for the marketing ability for this fight with Terrence Crawford and Errol Spence Jr. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, that fan base, which seems to be the loudest, has at every turn diminished all of Crawford's accomplishments from 135 to 147. You have pointed out that he has fought lackluster competition. You have pointed out that he's essentially not deserving of a fight. You have pointed out that he's on the wrong side of the street. You have pointed out that his opponent selection was poor and thus not worthy of Errol Spence Jr. coming to the table with him, right? So what you've inadvertently done is you have diverted casual interest away from this fight because of your loud voices. Now, when the casual public goes and researches this guy, they're going to see all of the comments, all of the banter, all of the videos with you guys essentially saying that Bud Crawford isn't worth a damn. He's just a default champion. What has he done? He hasn't done anything. He hasn't fought anyone. He's on the wrong side of the street. He should have gotten a belt. Oh, he did get a belt, but he beat Jeff Horn for it, so he didn't really beat anyone noteworthy to deserve a fight with Errol Spence. Oh, he beat Sean Porter, but Sean Porter was washed up after Errol Spence Jr. He wasn't the same fighter. Oh, he stopped Kell Brook in a more devastating fashion than Errol Spence Jr. did. But, you see where I'm going with this? It amazes me that Canelo Alvarez, as the A side, when he wants a fight, sends contracts and dictates terms to his opponent. It amazes me that De La Hoya did the same thing when he was the A side. It amazes me that Floyd Mayweather Jr. did the same thing when he was the A side. It amazes me that Manny Pacquiao not only did it to Keith Thurman, but also put a clause in the contract that he would not be doing vital blood testing for the fight. It amazes me that throughout the entire history of boxing, this has happened, essentially, where the A sides are the ones with the leverage, all the cards, the powerful promotional entities behind them, and they indeed are the ones who send the contracts out and say, this is what we're offering you, you either take it or leave it. And for some odd reason in this situation between Errol Spence Jr. and Terrence Bud Crawford, suddenly there's been a paradigm shift within the culture of boxing where this is suddenly not acceptable anymore. Well, Errol's the A side, he's his own boss, this, that, and the third, but he shouldn't do things the way that previous A-siders before him have done it. You know what this tells me? I'm not the smartest man in the world. It tells me you guys don't want to see the fucking fight. It tells me that a lot of you guys who have this sentiment are not confident that Errol Spence Jr. can go in there and beat Terrence Bud Crawford. You're not. Okay, you can come on my channel and you can debate me and you could say, this, that, and the third, and, he should have took 60-40, but never have we seen Errol Spence Jr. negotiate in public. We got to keep in mind here that Terrence Crawford didn't initiate public negotiations with Spence. Spence did. Okay, Spence was the one who opened his mouth and said he could take 60-40 or 70-30 or whatever we choose to give him. Right now, some of you guys in the boxing community are from the streets. Okay, so for the love of me, I don't understand how any of you with any nuts about yourselves or any manhood and dignity can sit there and say that you would allow yourselves to be sunned by someone in public and told what you're worth, essentially. That type of a conversation between men, real men, is designed to be had behind closed doors. And all of you guys who have either been to prison or been to jail or you're from the streets, you know better than that. And you know that Crawford is from the streets, and you know no one from the streets is going to take kindly to having someone son him and say, well, whatever I choose to give you, right? If Errol Spence Jr. really wanted to fight, he would have handled this situation how he handled all of his prior situations and took it behind closed doors before he even opened his mouth in public, okay? That man, too, just like his fan base, some of his fan base has also discredited Crawford at every single turn and put roadblocks and obstacles up, okay? Now, what I will say this in defense of Errol Spence Jr., I personally believe, I don't know if he's scared of Crawford, okay? I'm not going to open my mouth and say he's just scared of him. But what I do think is happening here is that he is ultimately an indirect victim of the culture of not only the PBC, but the boxing community and culture as well. This is a culture that we've seen run rampant in the PBC because this is the same reason I never encouraged Bud to go over to the PBC and sign with him. Because when Errol Spence was with the PBC, the only person he could get to fight him when he wanted to fight was Kell Brook. Keith Thurman is still dodging the man. Danny Garcia didn't fight him until he had nothing to offer in way of a championship belt. And Sean Porter was literally backed into a corner and avoided Spence for years and said that Errol Spence Jr. was not a part of his plan. Okay. And this was allowed to go on for years. Okay. Manny Pacquiao, all right, ducked Errol Spence Jr. for years until he saw what he believed to be a perceived weakness within Spence. And then he felt comfortable taking the fight, but as fate would so have it, he ran into Jordanis Ugas, who has a completely different style and physicality range than Errol Spence Jr. does, which ultimately is why he lost. On top of the fact that Ugas is not necessarily someone you want to come back and fight when you're in your 40s with the 2-year layoff. Okay, so, like the homie Thriller says, the boxing gods don't like ugly, and Pacquiao became a victim of that. But Manny Pacquiao, Keith Thurman, and Danny Garcia, along with Sean Porter, were all allowed to essentially hold the welterweight division up. Because if they would have just fought Spence when they were supposed to, Carlos Ocampo, Lamont Peterson, Chris Algieri, all these other fights wouldn't have happened. And those were filler fights that wasted time, essentially, where we could have been having these conversations 3.5 years prior, because the champions who were champions at the time would have did what they were supposed to do, but they didn't. Okay. And I'm starting to wonder if a lot of you guys are just fans of the PBC, or are you fans of boxing? Okay. I don't think you guys are fans of boxing. I think you guys are fans of promotional banners or platforms, and you're fans of fighters. Okay. While I am a huge Crawford fan, I am a fan of the sport. Okay. And there is no guarantee he beats Spence or Boots or anyone like that for that matter. But I don't care. I don't care if he loses or wins. I want to see it. Okay. And the way that a lot of you guys are moving, it's like you don't really want to see him in there with Spence, because a lot of you guys are sitting here saying, well, why can't he fight Boots? Why can't he fight Spence? Why aren't champions fighting champions? I'll tell you why you guys don't want to see that and you'd rather see him fight Boots. Because a part of you, whether you come on here on YouTube and admit it or not, you're scared that he's essentially going to lose to Crawford. And after all that shit that's been talked, after all the roadblocks that have been put in the way, if he goes in there and he makes light work of this man, it makes you all look idiotic. Okay. Now, I'm not going to give my prediction on the fight or what I see happening, but I can tell you right now, I want to see it. Okay. Regardless of what the outcome is. And I think as fans, we should all be clamoring to see this fight. All right. Enough of the fucking online promoter talk. All right. I get it. Business is important, but we've already established what needs to happen. Okay. And at this point, like I said, per boxing history, okay, the A side has the responsibility and the power to dictate the terms. All right. That's not Bud's job, essentially, to go and draw up a contract and send it to Earl Spence, because he's not in the position to do that. Okay. If he were, you guys wouldn't be sitting here claiming all this A-side stuff constantly every time we bring Crawford up. You would just say, well, Crawford has equal power and leverage to Earl Spence, so he could send that contract. But you guys know that's not true. Okay. You just don't want to face the facts here. All right. And for the PBC executive Tim Smith to basically come out and state, oh, well, Crawford will probably want too much. That's not really something I think we can make happen. And then he's asked, well, have you guys talked to Crawford? Well, no, we haven't sat down with him, or, we haven't talked to him or anything, but we just know he'll probably be too expensive. Okay. All right. A lot of you guys in the YouTube boxing community are smart enough to see what the fuck is going on here. All right. Enough of you guys are from the streets to see when someone does. You guys know better. Okay. Especially you guys who have been in the system. You know when a grown man doesn't want it with another grown man. Stop the bullshit. All right. You guys are pissing me off with this. You know better. Okay. And for whatever reason, I don't care whether it's fear. I don't care whether it's business. It is clear to me at this point that not only Spence, but the PBC, for whatever reason, does not want this fight to take place. Now, if Spence is able to beat Ugas, because that's not an easy fight, let's not act like it is, and he gets past him, and he calls Crawford out and comes at him with the negotiation, and he sends him a 60-40 contract, and Crawford denies it, my hands are up at that point. There's nothing I can say, right? I personally think the fight should be more of a 55-45 type of ordeal, but I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a promoter. That's just my opinion, and it doesn't matter, right? The reality of it is that fight's going to do huge numbers, and likely we'll have a rematch clause, which means that what can be negotiated in that fight is, yeah, let's say Bud takes 40%, but he beats him. Then in the rematch, he can take a higher percentage, and then it can flip-flop, and Bud can be the 60-40 earner for the second fight. I'd be perfectly fine with that. I personally want to see him take the 40% and just beat Spence's ass, because I'm pretty sure he's going to win that fight. for several reasons. And if you want my prediction and analysis on why I see him winning the fight, just let me know in the comments below, and I'll do another video about that. But as far as I'm concerned, like I said, it's past the point of he said, she said. It's past the point of, well, Bud's got to do this, that, and the third. You guys have already basically ran this man's reputation into the mud, along with Bob Arum. You know, Bob Arum has done the same thing. You know, Bud has been essentially sabotaged, somewhat his fault, somewhat Bob Arum's fault, somewhat the diehard zealot sector of Spence fandom's fault. There are several factors here that are playing into this as to why the fight is not only losing luster, but why people are no longer willing to essentially invest in it, right? You got to be careful with your words, okay? When you go out here, like I said, and you make a concerted effort to discredit a man at every turn, no matter what he's done, then you are essentially causing the casual boxing public to do the same as well, which will essentially take interest away from the fight. And now we're in the situation we're in right now, where it seems like the only people that are clamoring for this fight are hardcore boxing fans. How did we get here? And how do we prevent ourselves from ever getting here again? Didn't Mayweather Pacquiao teach any of us anything? And shit, truth be told, Mayweather, as the A side, told Manny, I'll wire you $40 million up front, and all you got to do is just take an Olympic-style blood test. That was what held that fight up, right? The fans, we all wanted to see it. But for some reason with this fight, man, things have changed, right? They've changed, okay? I'm just going to end it on this. Either you guys want the fight or you don't, all right? The bottom line is this. They are prize fighters. Who's paying their prize? You think Bob Arum and Al Heyman and all these guys and these promotional entities get paid if we don't buy the fights? They're doing it for our entertainment, and we're the ones putting the money in their wallets. Remember that, okay? It ain't all about them. It's about what we demand. It's about what we want. They could sort all that promotional bullshit out themselves. That's not our job, okay? So on that note, I'm going to end this video. You guys like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll be back on here in a few. Signing out.